Okay, so in the last video we talked about Napoleon's beginnings and how he rose to be important in France and gained the trust of the National Convention and to some extent the Directory. So in this video we're going to talk about how he becomes the leader of France and some changes he makes once he's in charge of the country. So just to review, we talked in the last video about the Paris Uprising in 1795, where he controlled the crowd with what he called a whiff of grape shot and fired cannons into a crowd of protesters who were upset with the National Convention and wanted to bring back the monarchy. And this really showed us that Napoleon doesn't mess around. What he wants is what he gets, and there's really no other way but Napoleon's way to solve a problem. Regardless, he certainly gains brownie points with the National Convention by breaking up this crowd and protecting them. And when the National Convention gives away to the Directory, Napoleon will have a similar high standing with the Directory, although he'll later go on to overthrow that government himself. So we talked again in the last video about how he becomes the leader of France. And after the Reign of Terror, the Directory is ruling France with very little success because it takes all 5 directors to make any decision. Nothing's getting done, and bread prices are skyrocketing back to prices that we saw during Louis XVI's reign, and people are poor and miserable just like they were before because they have a very ineffective government. It's almost like they tried so hard to make a government that was made it impossible for someone to run away with the power like Robespierre, that they actually made the government too restrictive and can't get anything done. In fact, the directors often tried to overthrow each other in that government with little success. So the Directory was a failure of a government, and people get so sick of it that they really get to the point where they're like, you know, if anybody would come in and just get rid of this government and take control, I would be okay with that as long as something's getting done. Napoleon, obviously having a big level of self-awareness and self-esteem, thinks that he is the one who can save France. So he decides to overthrow the Directory in 1799 in a coup d'etat. A coup d'etat, which in French literally means to sweep out the government. So it's to overthrow a government. So in 1799, he organizes this coup d'etat, and Abbé Sieyès, who we know from What is the Third Estate, was actually a director at this time, and he's in on it. Napoleon's brother is the president of the Council of 500, so he's in on it on that side. And Napoleon basically divides and conquers, which is what he does in his military strategy. He puts the Council of 500 in one place, he puts the directors in another place, and he has his armies basically seize each one and force them to hand over power. And he creates this new government called the French Consulate. The French Consulate. And he is going to be given the title of First Consul. And there's basically 3 consuls in the French Consulate. Napoleon is First Consul. Roger Ducos, one of his friends, is Second Consul, and Abbé Sieyès actually becomes the 3rd Consul. So the 3 men that are the consuls are supposed to be in charge of France after they overthrow the Directory. But as we quickly see, Napoleon really sees himself as the only leader of France. So let's talk about Napoleon as a ruler. Probably one of the most important things he does upon becoming ruler of France is he brings back the Catholic Church under his control in a document called the Concordat, which is a deal that he cuts with the Pope. And he basically says to the Pope, look, the Catholic Church can come back, we will recognize the Catholic Church, which was destroyed in France during the Reign of Terror, but here's the catch. I want to be able to appoint all of the bishops. And we'll talk in class when we look at the Concordat about why he made that stipulation and why that was a good move for Napoleon. But he does bring back the Catholic Church through the Concordat. He also establishes a new set of laws called the Napoleonic Code, which he names after himself. He claims that he wrote these laws, but they were really written by a committee that he oversaw, and he looked at some drafts, but he didn't really sit down and write the volumes of laws that came out of this code. This code is important for 2 reasons. One, it does include some things from the Revolution, some ideas of the Revolution, like equal protection under the law, for example, regardless of what estate you were in before the Revolution. It does have flaws, though. Women have barely any rights legally in the Napoleonic Code, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee freedom of speech, freedom of press. In fact, anything against Napoleon is not allowed in this new government. But regardless, he creates the Napoleonic Code. The second reason why the Napoleonic Code is important is that it creates a set of laws that are the same no matter where you go in France. Before the Revolution, the laws in Lyon could be different from the laws in Caen or Paris or Normandy, depending on where you went. And this created a lot of confusion, especially with taxes, and you could be breaking the law in one place and it could completely find where you live. So the Napoleonic Code actually makes it easier. You know the law is the law wherever you go in France. And that kind of goes along with Napoleon reorganizing the government and setting up a centralized government in France. There were over 100 départements, or departments, like little tiny governments all throughout France before the Revolution. And what Napoleon says is from now on, each one of those governments answers to a central government in Paris. And you can imagine who is in charge of that Paris government. It's Napoleon. So he creates a centralized government. It streamlines things. It makes it easier for the governments to run in different parts of the country, but it also consolidates power under Napoleon. He calls the shots everywhere in France. He also creates high schools and a public school system, and the high schools are called lycées, and also teacher schools, which are called écoles normales, or normal schools. And this is a public education. It was not free. You had to pay to go. But the idea here is that he's going to provide an education that indoctrinates or really brainwashes kids into the ideas that Napoleon is the greatest, but it also provides an opportunity for people to get educated outside of, say, monasteries or churches or Catholic schools, which is where people usually got their education before this. He understood the value of education, and although it wasn't free for everybody, he knew that if somebody could afford a public education, it was good for France for people to be educated. So we can thank Napoleon for that. Interesting fact, Bridgewater State, way before it was Bridgewater State University, was Bridgewater Teachers College, and before that it was Bridgewater Normal School, which means that it used the same teacher school model that was created in France under Napoleon. And interestingly enough, Napoleon gives more power back to the noble upper class. And he does this because he admits that the people who are rich in the society are pretty powerful, and he wants them on his side if he's going to get his way. So he actually, it's not the old regime. They don't have any special privileges under the law, but he does allow them to live it up and to be his friend. So he has the support of the people with the money in French society. So as we go through the documents this week, there are three essential questions that we have to pay attention to. One, how was Napoleon able to rise to become the dictator of France? This revolution is supposed to be about equality and democracy, yet the people have just put all of their trust in one man. Even though he says there's three consuls, as you can see, it was really Napoleon running the show. Second, how did Napoleon reform French society? We're going to see some changes, especially in the Napoleonic Code. Some things might be from the revolution, a revolutionary ideal. Other things kind of take a step back. All throughout this, Napoleon did say himself, he said, I am the revolution. He really did believe that he was forwarding the ideas of the revolution. It's just that we got it wrong before, that there were too many cooks in the kitchen with the National Convention and the Directory, that Napoleon is the smart guy who's going to lead France by himself, and we're going to be better off because of it. And then lastly, was Napoleon continuing the revolution, or was he just a new autocratic ruler, a ruler with all the power? Have we traded a king for a dictator? Does Napoleon see himself as a king who is chosen by the people? Was he even chosen by the people? These are the questions that you really want to pay attention to while we're in class and looking at documents this week. So what I recommend is you write these questions down and you keep them handy so we can keep going back to these questions as we look at documents this week. So that's part 2 of the Napoleon Notes, and in part 3 we'll talk about Napoleon taking the show on the road and expanding this revolution and expanding the French Empire beyond the borders of France.